Hello, and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I am your host, Steve Halley. With me, as per usual, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. Galen, how are you this fine Thursday?
Good, man. Summertime. Finally here.
Yeah,
Everything
you're
gets
look
better in the summer.
you're looking summery, my friend.
Oh,
Yeah,
appreciate you.
yeah. And game one of the finals is in the books. People in New York are probably celebrating.
I would imagine.
All of
Uh,
that's exciting.
I just want to put out a public service announcement. Do not run onto courts of
Oh my
ongoing
God, dude.
finals games to take selfies. Don't do it. And more importantly, the broadcasters, please do not show the people doing it and encourage other people to do it.
That was interesting. So this dude ran onto the court during, I think, a timeout. And I think he was live streaming or something. They grabbed him really fast and got him out of there. And the broadcasters, to their credit, moved past it very quickly. But then they replayed it for some reason. It's like, don't do that. Yeah, totally.
Don't do it.
Don't
Yeah,
do it.
that symbolizes everything I think is going wrong with the world, by the way.
Individuals who need attention. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. The other
Um,
thing related, I'm going to do the segue this time. Also
ooh,
going wrong with the world, I believe the cheapest ticket to a game at the Garden for the finals was somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,000,
wow,
which seems expensive and likely to put someone into debt. I'll leave it to you.
to debt. And would you say some of that increase in pricing has to do with an inflationary environment, Galen?
I would say that.
Yeah, perhaps a macro inflationary environment. Nice segue.
Thank you.
Yeah, I approve. Yeah, that's a solid A to A minus, let's call it. But takes a little
Great
practice.
inflation, also
Yeah,
on point.
it's a gentleman's A minus.
Yeah.
That's right. So we have a short but sweet episode for you folks today. We are going to be talking about the national debt. This is something that we've brought up repeatedly throughout the course of this show over the roughly 18 months that we've been doing this in context of where the United States seems to be headed long term. And the context is always, well, the United States remains hegemonic as far as military goes, even though we do not always choose to use our military in an efficient or effective manner strategically. We still have plenty of hardware. We still have the most dynamic economy in the world. We talked about that in reference to AI, for instance. We're we're at the forefront of many different technological revolutions. Not all of them. The Chinese are at the forefront of many important ones, especially when it comes to electrification and things like that. But the U.S., still has the world's biggest economy, the world's premier scientific base, not so much industrial base anymore, the world's premier military power. But there are problems at the margins, unwise wars, and unwise spending being two of those big problems. And we have pointed to the accrual of the national debt as one of the biggest, if not the biggest problem facing the United States right now, if we are talking about whether the United States will remain a superpower going into the mid to long term. So we're going to dig into that today on our episode. We don't have a ton of time to do it because we have a hard out. So we're going to be efficient about it, unlike our spending has been over the last, let's call it 50 years, plus or minus.
The last 25.
Certainly the last 25, but even before then, starting in the 1980s, let's call
Yeah.
it. Should we quickly set the historical table for how we've, where we are now and kind of how we got there as far as the national debt?
Sure. I wanted to do this episode. This is a topic, I guess, weirdly near and dear to my heart. I think just because it has kind of been slowly brewing for pretty
Our
much
entire lifetime?
yeah,
Yeah.
like certainly my entire you know, the span of my adulthood. And it's one of those things where I kind of kept keeping an eye on it, being like, when are we going to deal with this? And one of the reasons I want to do it is because I even remember back to 15, 20 years ago, people expressing the concern this would have major geopolitical consequences if left unaddressed. And, I'm increasingly of the view that it has been left unaddressed and appears like it will continue to be left unaddressed. And unfortunately, this is one of those things that if you do leave it unaddressed, will metastasize and you could get into a situation where you don't really have a way out. I'm going to start the clock circa 2000.
Okay.
We could probably have a debate about, as you said, the Reagan administration really does a lot of deficit spending. The debt goes up quite a bit during that period. But, around the turn of the century, the ratio of US debt to GDP is something like 30%. And famously, Bill Clinton left office with a budget surplus. And it was expected that over a few decades, the US debt was actually going to be paid off on that same trajectory.
That's
Uh,
crazy. Let me
you
stop you
fast,
right there. That's
yeah,
insane. That's not that long ago.
no, yeah, like, excuse me if I've made this analogy before, but like US budgeting since 2000 sort of reminds me of like Yahoo in the 90s, where it was like you needed to get like one big decision right out of 10. And unfortunately, you went over 10. Like, I think they could have bought
Yeah.
Google for $1 million or Facebook for $1 million. And they're like, yeah, we don't want that. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna speak with broad brushes, but like you had the Bush tax cuts in 2001, 2003, I believe. Those were largely unpaid for. The US obviously fought multiple wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which lasted a very long time. More importantly than any of those was the Great Recession, because it greatly restricted economic growth, which obviously limits the government's tax revenue. You also had government stimulus as part of that response to the
Bailouts.
crisis. Yes, so spending going up, tax receipts going down. You had that same thing happen again when the COVID pandemic hit in 2020. And since then, both the Democrats under Joe Biden and more recently Republicans under Trump with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act last summer passed pretty significant stimulus bills and tax cuts that also have gone unpaid for. Oh, and by the way, we had this period where people were, coming up with theories like modern monetary theory that debt didn't matter because interest rates would stay low. Turned out interest rates did not permanently stay low. And as of, I believe, 2024, US payments on interest exceed US defense spending,
Mhm.
which is remarkable because the US defense budget is massive. And the Trump administration just submitted a budget that expands upon that by like 40 to 50%, up to $1.5 trillion. And more recently, the US debt to GDP ratio has surpassed 100%, which is a number not seen since World War II. And that's because the United States was fighting World War II. So I'll leave it at that, but it's kind of a long story of, you know, refusal to raise taxes, refusal to reform entitlements, bailout spending, stimulus, and rising interest rates that have left the US fiscally in a precarious position.
That's right. And notably, several real emergencies that the country had to respond to. You talked about the Great Recession. That was a real emergency that could have easily turned into a global depression
Yeah.
with a big D, kind of like the Great Depression, if the administrations hadn't stepped in with massive bailout and stimulus spending, like, TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. Like,
Yeah.
the US government basically acquired a bunch of like corporate debt effectively to
Highly
backstop the
controversial
markets.
at the time,
It was.
proved quite effective ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, like, we don't know what the counterfactual actually would have been,
Sure.
but there was an
Yeah.
argument at the time. It's like, these guys don't deserve bailouts. They were feckless and they should be left to fail. That's how capitalism's supposed to work, right? Like, obviously that didn't happen, and neither did anybody go to jail.
Yeah,
Uh,
which I think, not to get on a different topic, I think that part, the fact that so few people suffered consequences, that plus the shock of globalization accounts, at least to some great degree, for the populist wave politically we've seen in the past 15 years or so.
Absolutely. And then COVID-19 was also a real global emergency. And I mean, That's within living memory, obviously. 1 million people in this country died. People are still dying in this country of COVID. Nobody likes to think about it or talk about it, really. Maybe at some point in the future, we'll do like a proper sort of retrospective on what the hell happened there. But it's still too close and too painful for people. I think the whole country just wants to pretend that it didn't happen and move on. But the fact remains is like, starting with Trump and then especially with the Biden administration, we went like full on helicopter money because we had lockdowns. People didn't know how dangerous this was or not. We erred on the side of caution. And even at the time, like the way that we did this was criticized for being pretty inefficient in terms of the amount of money we spent and how we spent it. We kind of just started writing the entire country checks, more or less. And like looking back at that, it's like it was defensible at the time because of the unknowns. But at the time, people were like, this is a ton of money. It's going to really exacerbate the debt problem. And like there could be smarter and more efficient ways of doing this. But they were just, it didn't happen. Like we spent that money and now here we are. Right. But you look at those two emergencies on the graph of debt and you can see basically the graph turn upwards twice.
Yeah. And I mean, just on this point, like in the same way, if you're running a household, you'd like to have an emergency fund. One problem, aside from the geopolitical consequences of this, is like there will be another emergency. There will be another recession. There will be another economic slowdown. You want to be putting money away or be in a position where you can respond aggressively as the US did during those crises. And one concern people have today, economists, is the Treasury won't be able to respond as aggressively as it did in those instances.
Yeah, not as aggressively, or if it tries to do it aggressively, it'll make the situation even worse and accelerate things even faster.
Yeah.
So,
and actually, since we're on it, do you want to talk briefly about Simpson-Bowles, which was like the last genuine effort to try to deal with this, which
I think that's important. People recognize this was happening really rapidly. Like within a decade, it's like basically from the 2000s into the 2010s, Congress was like, this is bad. Everybody stop. Let's do a bipartisan commission led by
Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson.
It was a bipartisan commission and it was a technocratic commission. So it was not about like, oh, we're going to get Democratic priorities through or Republican priorities through or preserve those priorities, because nobody likes the idea of having to balance the budget and go through your spending and cut stuff, right? Republicans, don't want to raise taxes famously ever. And they've been the no tax orthodoxy party, basically since the early 90s, since Bush the Elder did it and lost an election.
And he paid the price for it.
He paid the price. Yeah. So that's on the Republican side. We don't want higher taxes. On the Democratic side, we don't want entitlement reform. So entitlements, especially Social Security and Medicare, those were installed under two, historic Democratic presidential regimes, Roosevelt and then Johnson, respectively. These are super popular programs that people rely on, but they're the two biggest line items in the budget.
And I should have mentioned this earlier, the fact that we have a large generation of baby boomers who are aging means that these costs are set to rise quite a bit.
Yes, they will continue to rise as that generation ages and needs more care and draws down Social Security. And I think like every American is aware of this, right? But like part of what's important about those entitlements is that they are non-discretionary. So at the time, those percentages were set by legislation, and by law, we need to spend a certain amount on those programs. And it was foreseen that the costs would rise. But the thinking was at some point in the future, if it needed to be adjusted, we would be able to do that via legislation. But the United States can no longer pass bipartisan legislation, especially on entitlement reform. So anyway, Simpson-Bowles was an effort to bring the parties together and to look really hard and try to create a balanced program that would make everybody not happy, but as happy as possible.
Or everyone everyone equally unhappy
That's
politically.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
Everybody would have to sacrifice. And that's
Yeah.
kind of the program that they came up with. They came up with closing tax loopholes, which would, by the way, allow them to lower marginal tax rates while raising
Yep.
revenue. Right? That's a no-brainer, right?
Well, another one, I know no one likes paying taxes, obviously. I think probably no one really likes the IRS, but like the fact that the US does not really, for a variety of reasons, some legitimate, but a lot of it political, does not really adequately resource the IRS means the US government has enormous amounts of tax revenue that it just doesn't collect each year.
Yep.
So that's another problem. Sorry to
Yep.
interrupt.
No, it's okay. And by the way, the funding for the IRS basically correlates with who's in power. When the Democrats are in power, it gets more funding. When the Republicans are in power, it gets starved. It's like clockwork, right? So Simpson Bowles looked at tax reform. It looked at entitlement reform. So actually passing legislation to reform Medicare and Social Security. And it looked at military retrenchment and procurement. And like all of these things are third rails. There were like 3 third rails, but they worked basically in good faith, in bipartisan good faith, on a program that they would have presented to Congress if they had gotten 3 more votes to get out of committee.
And I believe the goal of that plan was to bring debt to GDP down to roughly 40%. So, which is a completely doable number, but I just want to highlight that it's not like that would have paid off the US debt entirely.
No, but it would have bent the curve and
bent the curve substantially. Yeah.
Yeah, so this was 2010, and the idea was by 2035, if I'm remembering correctly, get it down from this, basically the upward exponential to more of like the logarithmic, where it's starting to point down. And everybody would have had to sacrifice. And the commission came 3 votes. I think they had 18 people on the commission. They needed 14 to advance it to a mandatory full vote in Congress. They got 11 because by the 2010s, even that bipartisan commission was too polarized. So we had folks like further on the left and further on the right who were unwilling to make those compromises for the sake of the future. And we fell 3 votes short of our last best chance to do this democratically. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to make one more point on the unpopularity of this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but another provision in there was getting rid of writing off mortgage interest payments, right?
Correct. That was part of tax reform.
So, just as an example of how hard this would be politically, that's going to run into opposition from pretty much every homeowner in the United States. This was going to be very, very difficult politically. And for me personally, this is the source of my pessimism on the topic. I think 2011 was the first major debt ceiling standoff.
Interesting.
Where it looked like, or at least the Republicans in Congress were threatening to not raise the debt ceiling. And that's where you got this famous thing, the sequester.
Yes.
Where you had a super committee and even they deadlocked 3-3. And so there had to be these mandatory cuts, including on defense spending. And to me, it just shows, even at a time when there was relative urgency, politically, it was too hard to get done. And we pretty much have not done anything about it since. And in fact, have made it a lot worse with a lot more spending since.
I have a personal story about the sequester because you and I were at UCLA in graduate school.
That's right.
A PhD program at the time. And the sequester fell at a time where I was set to be a research assistant for Professor Art Stein on a government-funded project that was going to be looking at insurgencies in Indonesia and trying to figure out the mathematical pattern for how those things grew and spread. And I was excited about that. I was doing research on Indonesia, but the money didn't come through. It got sequestered. So, who knows where I would be? Maybe I'd be an academic. If that had continued. That's all right. Things have worked out for the best.
I guess in a bit of self-deprecation, maybe for the best then that the sequester happened for you.
Perhaps.
Well, okay. So before we get to the kind of the geopolitical implications of all of this. Like, there are a few ways this could be addressed. I suppose there could be some sort of exogenous political event that provides the political space to have something. Obviously, the problem is much harder to address now than it was in 2010, but gets you a Simpson Bowles type, downward trajectory on it. We just explained why we find that unlikely. The US could just do a straight out sovereign default. The Congress could refuse to raise the debt ceiling.
That's called a technical default, because one of the things about the United States is the United States can print its own money, and everybody needs dollars. And this is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because we have the power to just invent money out of thin air to pay for anything, and people have to be okay with that. For a lot of different reasons. The main reason is the dollar is the world's reserve currency, and everybody needs dollars in order to participate in global trade, period, full stop. There are a few sort of things growing around the margins to avoid that, but it's still the case that everybody needs dollars. And we can invent dollars out of things, right? That's a blessing. It's called an exorbitant privilege. And I think the French finance minister in the 60s famously
Yes.
in a pejorative sense, he was not happy about this, understandably, but like, we've been in the catbird seat. There's nothing anybody can do about it other than us using it too much.
Yeah, and
this is where the curse part comes in.
There comes with advantages like seniorage, which is essentially like the government almost making money off of printing money because it's worth more than it costs to make it. In effect,
we
right?
sell dollars.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is one of the hardest concepts to. It's actually a very easy concept to understand, but it's one of the key concepts in international political economy and trade. Is you need to buy and sell currencies in order to settle international debts. And because most international debts are settled in dollars, everybody needs to buy dollars from us. They give us their currencies, we give them dollars, right? And that leads to a whole bunch of really favorable side effects for us. There's always demand for dollars. There's always demand for government debt.
Can generally borrow in your own current, right? Borrow at lower interest rates. We've talked about economic statecraft previously, so I won't get back into it, but, it gives sanctions more of a bite if you're the United States. You can, I guess I'll ask you to talk about the 2 times when the US kind of technically has defaulted on its debt in the past, but the other instrument, which most people, including Kenneth Rogoff, has this good book, might have mentioned it on the show before, Our Dollar, Your Problem, which was the famous line attributed to Nixon's Treasury Secretary, John Connally. Basically, that the most likely way the US government is going to try to handle this is to do something called financial repression. So do you want to explain what that is and the past instances where the US sort of actually has in fact defaulted on its debt?
Yeah, I think before I do that, it won't make sense unless I explain how debt and interest rates work.
Sure.
And anybody who's a consumer in this country probably has a pretty good intuitive understanding. You have a credit rating that allows you to borrow money at a certain interest rate. And the worse your credit rating is, the more creditors demand in interest, you have to pay them more in order to borrow that money, because they're looking at you and they're like, how are you going to pay this back? Right? Now, if you have a reputation for always paying it back, that helps your credit rating. But it's also related to just the sheer volume of the amount of debt that you take, right? So other things equal, the more debt that you have, regardless of what you're doing with it, the higher interest rate is usually going to be. Now, if you're doing unwise things with it and your income can't support that debt, then your interest rates are good. So all of that should be pretty intuitive. It's the same thing for countries, even the United States, which can literally print its own money to pay other people back when it feels like, right? The US does that by issuing T-bills, treasury bills, and foreigners come in and buy it. Also, Americans buy debt from the government. It's like most people have some treasuries in their portfolio. It's considered the largest, most liquid, highest class government debt in the world. It's considered the sort of risk-free interest rate because the United States is the most powerful country in world history. It's also the most credible country in world history when it comes to repaying that. So we've gotten lower interest rates as part of that exorbitant privilege. Now, if our debt gets too high, though, other countries are going to want higher interest rates in order to keep lending to us. That's just a law of financial physics. It's like financial gravity because they're looking at us and they're like, when are we going to get paid back? How are these guys going to pay us back? Are they going to grow their way out of this? Maybe, but it's more likely that they're going to cheat somehow. How do you cheat? You do something called financial repression. What does that mean? You artificially lower interest rates. You put a cap on interest rates and you let inflation run wild. So you are paying back that debt in money that is worth less. And this is an overwhelming temptation to do this is to basically devalue your currency because that's so much easier than like spending less or figuring out how to grow faster. It's a shortcut, right?
In the broadest sense, it's inflating your way out of the debt.
Yeah, exactly. It's a cheat mode, but it's also a well understood cheat mode that other countries have done in the past, and they suspect the United States will be doing it in the future because guess what? The United States has done it in the past too. It has substituted cheap money or soft money for hard money, right? Money that we can print more of for money that we can't print more of, particularly gold. Now, you can take more gold out of the ground up to a certain point, but you cannot print gold the same way that you can print greenbacks, right? And there have been two instances in this country's recent history within the last 100 years where the U.S. was like, we said that we were going to pay you back in gold, but we're just not going to do that anymore. Straight up, right?
Or so in the first case, I think it was we will pay you less for the gold. And
then it's actually worth, right? So that's a form of financial repression. During the Great Depression in 1933 and 34, the Roosevelt administration confiscated most private gold holdings in the U.S. You were not allowed to hold more than $100 in gold. And at this point in time, you could actually go to the bank with your greenbacks and be like, I want to trade these in for gold at the official exchange rate. By executive order, Roosevelt just gave everybody a huge haircut and dropped that official exchange rate. It's like, okay, well, now you get this much gold. Sorry. and he suspended the ability to do that. And that amounted to basically allowing the currency to inflate wildly.
Yeah. You can see why it's more attractive than the government just saying, we're not going to pay you, right? And just being that naked about it. This is like kind of putting a disguise on it. Like, we're just, doing some gimmicks to make the debt servicing a little bit easier.
Nobody was fooled by it, which is why it became illegal to hold gold. It's like you can't actually do that anymore and you might go to jail.
There was a Supreme Court case ultimately over it.
So that was 1933. That was just like bald-faced. It's like, we're going to take everybody's gold. Sorry, we're not sorry, right? It's like national emergency. It's Great Depression. We don't have a choice and neither do you. Now, the Nixon case is a little bit different. So this was in 1971 when things were not going that great for the United States economically. And we were still on what was called the Bretton Woods system post-World War II, where basically all the world's currencies were pegged to the dollar by international agreement. That is to say, when the dollar went up, they went up. The dollar went down, they went down. And the dollar was also pegged to gold. So gold stood behind the dollar and also all the world's currencies. And the United States started to run out of gold.
Because of a recurring balance of payments problem, essentially.
Correct. Yeah. And, our currency was inflating due to the energy crisis, for instance, spending on the Vietnam War, lack of economic dynamism, and so on.
Spending on the Great Society programs, obviously, it was doing that without, and doing the Vietnam War, both very, very expensive.
Very expensive. So Nixon broke the link between the dollar and gold once and for all. And this was the point in time where the United States moved to a pure fiat currency. So there is no longer any formal relationship between the dollar and gold. The dollar is not convertible into gold anymore. It's not to say that you can't buy gold with dollars or whatever. And the US and many other countries have gold holdings, large ones. But as a debtor, as a holder of US currency, you cannot demand gold from the anymore. And so that was another form of technical default, actually. It was a redefinition of the hardness or softness of US currency. We moved towards the ability to print more of our own money and inflate away the debt. So that is basically how financial repression works.
And I just want to say, like, because of that, as you said, it's extremely tempting to do this.
Yes.
Because the political obstacles or the taking your medicine, so to speak, is so politically difficult.
In a democracy. Yeah.
Yes. This is one of the reasons. There are other reasons as well, but China has really reduced its dollar reserves over the past 5 to 10 years. I think at a peak, it was around, $1.3 trillion it held in dollar reserves, something like that. It's about half that now, maybe a little bit more than half. And one of the reasons for that is China is looking at the US political system and saying, really doesn't look like the US is going to actually get its fiscal house in order. So this debt's going to be worth less. So maybe it's time to do some de-risking. So, countries are already taking action on it. All right. Well, maybe we should talk about, since we only have like another 10 minutes, some of the geopolitical implications and maybe do some like cross-country comparisons. One comparison that gets brought up a lot is Japan today. I think Japanese debt to GDP is over 200% now, something like that.
Correct. Yeah.
Now, there's a key difference, which is that Japan does not issue debt to foreign entities and other states. It's held almost entirely by Japanese citizens, I believe, which is a key difference. And even so, Japan has basically not experienced much economic growth, more or less, since the end of the Cold War. 1991, there's all these books, Japan actually won the Cold War just prior to its economy completely tapering off, sort of known as the lost decades. Paul Kennedy in The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which he makes the key argument that really the underpinning of geopolitical power is economic power, which, is what we're about to talk about. He sort of says the U.S. is going to be in bad shape because of this as the Cold War is ending. Maybe he was just a little bit early on that prediction. But I think you and I both found the case of the UK post-World War II a more potentially useful predictor of what's going to happen with the United States going forward. So do you want to talk a little bit about what that looked like?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the UK, first of all, used to have the world's reserve currency. It's the pound sterling, which still exists, and it's still a major currency, but it's secondary. It's no longer the world's reserve currency. Only a small percentage of global transactions are resolved in pound sterling. I think sub 10%, maybe even sub 5% at this point in time. But it used to be kind of like the dollar, 70%, 80%, They ran the world economy from London. And then they won 2 wars, but at great costs, massive costs, to the point where their debt to GDP went to, I believe, 250% by the end of World War II. And then the socialists took power and established things like the National Health Service, the Labor Party, which at this point was very socialist, not so much anymore. And this is a entitlement that the British have found very difficult to reform. And their debt stayed very high, leading to periods of inflation and currency crises. In fact, it got so bad that in 1976, Britain required an IMF bailout to settle its debts. And this was the former hegemon. So it was a matter of some number of decades, but the UK went from being on top of the world to barely winning two massive wars and then spending on top of that. And within another 3 decades, it was basically out of the game. Now, the UK is still a great power. It still can project military power, sort of. But I don't think anybody would argue. In fact, we've talked on this show. It's, I put it at number 6 in the top 10, something like that. That might be generous, depending on how you define these things. And that is the most likely trajectory for the United States at this point in time.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's not so much a cataclysm as it is a slow erosion. Because the more debt that you have, the more of that dry powder you need to spend servicing that debt. The more interest rates go up. When interest rates go up, less investment flows to the private sector. It's called the crowding out phenomenon. Because it's like, why would I lend to some startup at 10% interest or 15% interest when I can get 8% basically guaranteed from the government? It's a high interest rate, right? And if I'm a startup, it's like 15% is too high. It's like I can't even get started.
Yeah.
So you get less innovation, you get less R&D, and you get a productivity crisis. What's productivity? That's just the amount of goods and services produced on a per capita basis and per hour, basically. So it's an efficiency metric, and it improves when you improve your technology. So for instance, people are expecting a productivity boom out of AI, which might drive our economic growth. Some people are saying 3 to 5%, which we haven't seen for quite a long time, the size of our economy. But maybe this is a revolutionary technology, and everybody can suddenly do the work of like 10 people. It's like, yes, if that's the case, productivity will boom. We got the opposite in the UK because everybody was too busy paying the debt. There was no money to spark a productivity boom. And so you got economic stagnation instead. And that is still their problem. Same with Italy, same with France, all of these European countries, they're indebted, right?
And people have been worrying about this for a very long time. I believe the conference I was at was like issued under Chatham House rules, so I won't attribute who said it, but someone very, very knowledgeable about military budgeting. This was 13, 14 years ago. This was precisely what they said their concern was that at a certain point, the crowding out effect becomes really, really significant. And that was at a time when interest rates were historically very low.
And, Britain has had to cut its military budget.
So much so that, people who followed it at the time, the 2011 Libya intervention, the British and French were kind of the main people bringing things to a head. Obama was more hesitant. He ultimately was persuaded to do it. But the United States really had to lead that intervention because those countries weren't really capable of doing it militarily, even though it was not, a major war, say, against a great power in Eastern Europe or something like that.
Yeah.
But well, okay, since we're running out of time, like, I have 2 questions for you.
Yeah.
The first is more straightforward, which is, how do you assess the possibility that the U.S. actually gets its house in order? Like, I do think there is starting to be a recognition among Americans and a certain frustration that this issue just does not get tackled.
Really? I don't think so.
You don't think so? Okay, fair enough.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think there are any politicians.
Politicians, I'm not saying. I'm saying your average American. Yeah, politicians.
Maybe, but like, how willing is the average American to pay more taxes and get less stuff?
Yeah. Okay. So not high.
Not high. I think you can find Americans who want to cut taxes. You can find Americans who want to spend more on social programs. Like, you can find those. It's like, that's the exact opposite of what we need. We can even find people that, like, some people want to cut the military budget. It's like, okay, that's a start. right? But it's like, no, we actually need all three of those things, just like Simpson Bowles said.
Well, and as you said, like the entitlements are largely on autopilot, which makes it
Yes.
more difficult, right?
To get it off of autopilot, we need bipartisan legislation.
Yeah.
It's like there's never going to be bipartisan legislation again. I mean, maybe there
Okay.
will be. Maybe there will be some form of like unity government where there's some unifying figure and the center reasserts itself. We're sick of populism. This has gone really badly. I could see that happening at some point in the future, and like a return to equilibrium and like
Okay.
a real sort of national reform. That's possible. Is it likely? Not super likely. I
Okay.
would say. Yeah.
So you and I are on the same page with that.
The other door out is technological revolution, which is what we're currently betting on, especially with AI.
Better hope you're right.
Yeah, and I could see it being a big deal, but when people look at this, who know what they're talking about, it's like, how big of a deal? Is it going to be as big of a deal as the internet? Is it going to be as big of a deal as like mobile phones? Is it going to be even bigger than that? We don't know yet. If it's as big as the internet or mobile phones, it's probably not going to be big enough. It's like those were transformational, and like the personal computer revolution, you know, like this was a big deal for the economy and it led to productivity gains. But it's like we need like a boom, you know, like a railroad style boom, and that's the kind of investment that we're making right now. That investment is propping up the entire U.S. economy. It's like, yes, we're growing, but it's because just massive amounts of debt, massive amounts of investment that we expect to pay off. It's going to need to pay off huge, like best case scenario, you know? I have no idea if that's going to happen or not. Early returns, frankly, are like not that promising, but it's early.
Okay. Well, so then I guess my second question, which is a crazy, huge question to ask you to answer in about 30 to 60 seconds.
That's why they pay me the big bucks.
So like, what does this look like geopolitically if we're right and this remains unaddressed in, say, 25 years? Like, has US... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we don't have the world's best military technology anymore. Arguably, we don't right now because we've missed the drone revolution, but like we really don't anymore. We don't have the military R&D. We don't have a network of hundreds of bases all over the world. We have fewer aircraft carriers. We have a smaller Navy. We have a smaller Air Force. We have a smaller Army. Some would argue this would be a good thing for the U.S. and the world.
The restrictors.
Yeah, I tend to disagree with that, but I understand the argument and I respect it. But like we talked about last week with the Suez crisis, this will be a matter of can't.
Yeah.
It will not be a matter of wants.
Right. Which is why I would argue, to me, it is like, we can talk about U.S. adversaries. We can talk about nuclear proliferation. We can talk about wars in Eastern Europe. This has always been the issue that has kind of concerned me the most, because it's like we're moving from a situation of like a problem of political will to a problem of can't do it if it continues to fester. And unfortunately,
and we're still we're still a few decades away, and there are opportunities to exit even now.
Yeah.
And I want to make that clear, but it's like the way things are headed doesn't look good, and we're now placing what I would call speculative bets on our ability to get out of this, and the historical record just isn't that encouraging. You know?
Well, I guess we'll leave it there.
We'll leave it there. Cool. All right. This has been, as per usual, kind of a bummer episode of Global Tantrum. Thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for learning about the national debt. And we will talk to you all next week.
Cool. Good to see you, man.
Likewise.